I've always wanted a Galaxy Note, but I've had to make do with this, the Galaxy S22 Ultra. And this video is all about what an iPhone user thinks about Samsung's brand new flagship. Hello and welcome back to Ellis Reviews, and thank you for subscribing if you have, and if you haven't subscribed, the button is just down there. This is the brand new Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra. Now, if you don't know by now, I am normally an iPhone user, and in fact my daily driver is this, the iPhone 13 mini. Tiny phone compared to this huge Samsung S22 Ultra. And you've probably seen all of the reviews of this phone by now. It is basically a Galaxy Note in all but name. But I'm not gonna go into any of that today. The whole point of today's video is to tell you what I think about this phone, and also, what is it like compared to the iPhone? Is it worth switching? Is it worth all that money? Let's get into it. Quick note on the price, I chose the base level S22 Ultra, which comes with 128 gigabytes of storage and 8 gigabytes of RAM. That was £1,149 in the UK, but they did chuck in a free pair of Galaxy Buds Pro, which I'm currently waiting for. And you can also get 12 months free Disney+. So a few nice sweeteners thrown in by Samsung. You don't tend to get that with Apple. Onto the build quality first, and bearing in mind, I've not owned or used a Samsung phone for quite a number of years. I remember them being quite plasticky and just a notch below the iPhone in terms of build quality. That ain't the case anymore. This is a lovely piece of hardware. It's easily comparable with the iPhone Pro. Any of the Pros, the 13 Pro, the 12 Pro. iPhones have always been very well built. They're very kind of premium feeling, use very good materials. Trust me, Samsung have completely matched the iPhone in terms of build quality. So the S22 Ultra uses a mix of aluminium and glass, as you would expect. The glass is called Corning Gorilla Victor something, which it's basically one of the only phones on the planet, I believe, to use that particular glass. Don't hold me to that, it's probably been surpassed already, but it's basically very tough glass. The rear of the phone is this kind of matte finish. I went with the white one, which I think looks very smart, by the way, and it's very similar to the rear of the iPhone 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max, which again have this kind of matte finish. Now, this is a very slippy phone. The S22 Ultra will slip out of your hands very quickly. I do find the 13 Pro and Pro Max just to be a bit more grippy. And that does mean, particularly if you're me, you need to get a case for this thing. I bought one straight away. If you're interested, it is the Spigen. Is that how you pronounce it? I never know. Spigen. Anyway, it's one of those. I'll put a link in the description. Yeah, it just means you're not gonna drop this thing because you don't really want to drop 1,100 quid's worth of phone. Quite a lot has been said about the arrangement of the lenses on the back of the phone. When I first saw this, I thought, oh dear, that doesn't look good at all. Actually, in person and in real life, it looks really good. It's a very minimalist design, and I don't think the product photography, and even the B-roll I'm showing you now, I don't think it does it any justice, really. Just like the iPhone, it has these very shiny aluminium edges, and just like the iPhone, they get smudged very easily. I think they'll probably scratch quite easily as well, but there's no doubting that when this is polished and when you first get it out of the box, it looks stunning. So overall, build quality-wise, I am so impressed with the S22 Ultra. It feels really rigid, the buttons are really good quality. Top marks, Samsung. Boy, have you come on. The screen on the S22 Ultra is this massive 6.8-inch AMOLED panel. If you're used to smaller phones, certainly if you're used to the iPhone 13 mini, but even if you're used to, let's say, the iPhone 13 Pro, this is a big phone to get your hand around. Now, I had a bit of a head start with this because I have been using the Motorola G200, which has got pretty much the same dimensions as the S22 Ultra. These are just very, very tall phones, and that presents a bit of an issue for trousers. You know, if you're wearing jeans, for example, this thing feels a little bit uncomfortable in them. Now, the screen itself, I'm gonna have to refer to the specs, is a 3080 by 1440 pixels, and it also has settings for 1080p and 720p. So Samsung gives you this ability, because of course they do, to change the resolution on this phone. And those three settings, 720p, 1080p, and 1440p, are relatively different. 720, don't bother with that. The 1080 middle setting, which is what it comes set to, is very, very sharp. And then the 1440 is really, really super sharp. And I can see a difference between that really top-end 1440 and the 1080. Some people have said they can't spot anything at all, and it may come down to your eyesight. I have relatively good eyesight, but the result of that setting is the sharpest screen I've ever used on a smartphone. It also has a dynamic 120 Hz refresh rate, much like ProMotion on the iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max. Now, I am a recent convert to high refresh rate screens on phones. I've been using, obviously, the iPhone 13 mini over the last few months, and that doesn't have ProMotion. It has a standard 60Hz refresh rate screen, but the fact this has a variable refresh rate screen, just like the ProMotion on the iPhone 13 Pro, is fantastic because it means it preserves battery life, but still gives you that very, very smooth image. Samsung has also included something called Vision Boost for this phone. This isn't a setting that you can turn on or turn off, I don't think anyway. Let me know in the comments if you can. I couldn't find it anywhere. But basically, it's, to all intents and purposes, makes the screen very bright in direct sunlight. And trust me, it works brilliantly. I was using this at the weekend in very, very bright settings, and I've never had a phone where you can see the screen in any setting, no matter how bright the sun is. As is always the case with Samsung phones, the colors on this are very, very vivid. They're not too oversaturated either. I think Samsung have toned that down a little bit. The only thing I'm not that keen on is the way the display kind of wraps slightly around the left and right hand sides. The reason for that is that you get a bit of light fall off on both sides. So if you've got a white screen, for example, it looks a little bit darker on both edges, but I can forgive that because the screen is just so all-encompassing and just lovely to look at. The only thing I do miss is True Tone, which is what you get on the iPhone. True Tone basically corrects the white balance, kinda, on the phone to make the whites look white and match the ambient room light. Now, Samsung hasn't developed True Tone for their phones at all. I don't know why. They have created something though called Eye Vision Shield, which is a fantastic name. All that really does is change the warmth of the screen, so it makes it a bit more orange as the day goes on. It's not really True Tone. And if you place this against an iPhone with True Tone turned on, the display on the S22 Ultra does look very blue. But putting True Tone to one side, I can live without that. This is, I think, the best smartphone screen I have ever used. When it comes to performance, I had no idea that Samsung hands out different types of chip depending on where you live. So if you're in North America, Australia, India, and a few other places, you get the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 in the S22 Ultra. If, like me, you live in the UK or Europe, you get the Exynos 2200, which is Samsung's own chip. Now, I know nothing about either of these chips, so I'm not the person to come to for benchmarks, but the impression I get, and certainly what a lot of other people say, is that the Snapdragon is a much better chip than Samsung's own Exynos. That said, and bearing in mind I don't do benchmarks, as you hopefully know by now, this is actually a pretty quick phone. I've not noticed any slowdown. I think the 120Hz refresh rate screen has a big impact on that, but this feels like a quick phone. Occasionally you get a bit of judder when you're opening and closing apps, but nothing that's detrimental to the user experience. Now bear in mind, this is the base level S22 Ultra with 8GB of RAM. You can upgrade that if you want to, but if you don't want to spend any more money and you're a kind of normal, general smartphone user like me, so you don't play lots of games and do clever stuff with it, then you're going to get by fine with it, trust me. One UI is Samsung's take on Android, and again, if we go right back in time to when I used Samsung phones in the past, back then they used to make an absolute hash of Android. The good news is that One UI is pretty much stock Android, with one addition which is a bit annoying, particularly if you're an iPhone user. So on stock Android, you can do pretty much all of the swipe gestures that you're used to in iOS. So to get back to your home screen, you can flick it from the bottom, and you can kind of go left and right on the screen to move backwards and forwards on web pages and in apps. Now by default, you can't do that on the S22 Ultra because Samsung wants you to rely on their kind of bottom navigation bar. And that gives you 3 buttons, which used to be hardware buttons in older Samsung phones, but now they're obviously on the screen and they are back, home, and the app switcher. Now the good news is you can turn that off and you can turn on that flick up to go back to the home screen and even the swipe left, swipe right to go backwards and forwards. I did that pretty much straight away, and in doing that it feels far more stock Android-like, but also far more iOS-like, which for someone like me is really important. The only thing I would say is that if you're coming from iOS, you are going to have to give up some of the things that you get used to with iOS, and some of that could be apps. There are certain apps that I use, for example Fantastical, that aren't available on the Samsung. Equally, if you use a Mac, your S22 Ultra isn't going to play particularly well with that laptop, purely because it doesn't have all of the handoff capability and all the kind of Apple ecosystem things that you're used to in iOS. However, there are 2 things on Android and One UI that absolutely knock iOS into a cocked hat. The first one is the way that you can rearrange your apps and your widgets on the home screen without wanting to pull all of your hair out. For those not in the know, jiggle mode, as it is called by Apple, annoyingly, is, I think, one of their biggest failures on iOS. And it's basically the way that Apple expects you to rearrange apps on the home screen. You kind of press and hold one of the icons, they start jiggling around, hence jiggle mode, and it's near impossible to get them where you want them to be. You'll find on the S22 Ultra, it is not like that at all. It is an absolute joy to move around apps on this phone. I've also always loved the ability to swipe right from the home screen to get to the Google News feed on these phones, and it always seems to serve up really relevant content for me. So those two things, very, very simple things, make the experience with One UI and Android in general an absolute joy, I think. And it's just so close to iOS in the way it works if you turn off those features I mentioned earlier. Yeah, this is a real performer, this phone, but also a joy to use when it comes to the operating system. The S22 Ultra has a 5000 milliamp hour battery, and it is brilliant. Not quite as good as the battery in the 13 Pro Max, which I'll cover in a future video, but trust me, I took this away for a whole weekend, took it charged at 100% at about 9 o'clock in the morning on the Saturday, and I didn't need to charge it again until about 7 PM the next day on the Sunday. That isn't bad as far as I'm concerned, particularly when you bear in mind that the phone has this little addition in here, which I'll come on to in a moment, so there's less space in there for a battery, but somehow Samsung have packed a big battery in there and it really performs. The S Pen. That's this little thing which sits inside your S22 Ultra. And again, this is a kind of, well, let's be honest, this is what makes it a Note. I always wanted a Galaxy Note because of that S Pen. I just love the idea of pulling it out, jotting down a few notes on the screen, popping it back into its holder. It just seems so neat, so useful. In reality, it's a bit of a gimmick. Now don't get me wrong, it's very handy to sign PDFs, and I used it the other day to annotate an image that I'd taken from something, and that was quite useful. But note taking, it's partly to do with my handwriting, I think. My handwriting is dreadful, and I'm not very good at doing this kind of, police officer style note taking with the phone in one hand. When I do that, the handwriting is even worse than normal. So it results in quite messy handwritten notes. I need to spend more time with the S Pen. I've got no interest in using it to interact with the user interface. That seems a bit of a faff. Just use your finger, that's what the finger's for. That's what Steve Jobs always said. He had a very good point with that. But I do need to spend more time with this S Pen when it comes to note taking. And that is thanks to the iPad mini and the brilliant paper-like screen protector. The combination of that and the Apple Pencil have really got me into note taking without pen and paper. This just feels a bit too small, I think. So they do say never meet your heroes, don't they? But I am going to spend more time with this and I will report back. I just get the impression that the S Pen, for me, is going to spend more time in there. When it comes to the camera, I'm going to do some more testing on this. I'll be doing another video in a couple of weeks, so make sure you subscribe and hit that bell. The reason for that is that I've only very recently got the iPhone 13 Pro Max, and I want to test it really against the S22 Ultra because it's the most obvious comparison. That said, it is worth, of course, going through the specs. So this has a quad camera system, as you can see on the back, and that comprises a 22mm main camera, a 230mm telephoto, a 69mm telephoto, a 13mm ultra wide, and a front-facing camera that is 40 megapixels and can record 4K video. On the rear, you can record up to 8K, but it is worth bearing in mind there's a massive crop factor with that. So basically, if you choose 8K, it zooms in and you can't zoom back out. So you lose a big part of the frame. It's a bit of a shame, but 8K recording on a smartphone, don't really get it. Now, like I mentioned a moment ago, I am going to compare this against the iPhone 13 Pro Max in due course, but I thought it would still be worth doing a little comparison, literally, against the iPhone 13 mini. And the reason for that is, although it's a very different sensor and there's all sorts of reasons you shouldn't do this comparison, I love the camera in this phone. In fact, it is my favorite smartphone camera at the moment. So I thought, what the heck, let's do a little comparison between the S22 Ultra and the iPhone 13 mini. So I'll throw some of my test shots on the screen now for you. I think it's quite clear straight away that the S22 Ultra appears to have better dynamic range, so it can deal with those scenes where you've got very bright subjects and very dark subjects in the same frame. At times, the iPhone gets the exposure all wrong, whereas the S22 Ultra seems to balance the image quite nicely. I think on the selfie cam, I think the S22 Ultra looks a bit more natural, a bit sharper, although it is a bit of a noisier image compared to the iPhone 13. I think you can definitely get more detail out of the highlights, and these are completely unedited photos. I've done nothing with these at all. But as you can see in this shot, if you look at the sky at the top right-hand corner of the screen, although it's slightly cropped on the iPhone photo, you can see it's much more blown out for the iPhone, whereas the S22 Ultra captures the clouds and the blue sky. I think the iPhone does a bit more sharpening. You can see this on Eddie here. Look at his fur, it looks a bit sharper than it does on the S22 Ultra version. And portrait mode on the S22 Ultra is absolutely superb. And if you look at the different... Now, I think this is quite a tricky subject. There's no person involved. There's lots of gaps there. And I think the S22 Ultra does a much better job of separating the rounded edge of those headphone cups from the background. So I think this is a fantastic camera. I love the images this produces. Just make sure you stay tuned for a future video where I go into the differences between the iPhone 13 Pro Max and the S22 Ultra when it comes to photography. Having not used a Samsung phone for many years and being an iPhone fan myself, I was just immediately knocked back by the quality of this phone. That beautiful screen, the fantastic build quality, the One UI experience, which is probably the biggest surprise for me. This doesn't feel like a bloated, horrible version of Android. It's really enjoyable to use. The fantastic battery life, that brilliant camera system. There's a lot to love about this phone. So I think for Samsung fans, if you want the absolute best version of their latest phones, you're not going to be disappointed with this whatsoever. Whereas if you're an iPhone user and you fancy switching to the S22 Ultra, nearly did it right at the end, then you're not going to feel shortchanged. Now, if you've had way too much Samsung and Android from me today, and you'd rather hear me talk about the simply brilliant but tiny iPhone 13 mini, keep watching for a link to my full review of this brilliant little phone. But until next time, thank you so much for watching as always, and I'll catch you in the next video.